if you can't afford a pet, you shouldn't own one. How do you feel about that statement as a vet? I have mixed feelings about it. On the one hand, I have owned a practice. I've had to pay wages, the drug bills, and all the other things that keep the doors open. I've had to write off large amounts of unpaid bills because I'd been manipulated and sometimes outright lied to with promises of payments that never came. I've been cursed for being a greedy, money-hungry monster. I know you have too, probably. So I have felt that impotent rage of, if you can't afford it, don't have it, or at least don't make it my problem. But I've also seen, over and over and over, the joy that a pet can bring to those who can least afford veterinary care, or at least not the format of care that I had to offer. I've had to be that monster who has to sever that sacred human-animal bond because someone couldn't afford the solutions that I could offer. How do we balance this as a profession? This responsibility of care, the promise we solemnly made when we were given our vet degrees. How do we square that with the realities of business? Dr. Paul Magtelow has some thoughts. I'm Hubert Hemstra, and you're listening to The Vet Vault, where we poke at the tender spots of veterinary practice, and sometimes we find something surprisingly human underneath. And in this episode, I speak to Dr. Paul Magtelow, a veterinary surgeon who's worked for more than 20 years in the UK's charity sector. First at the PDSA, and now as a Director of Veterinary Services at the Blue Cross. These are the front lines where effective pet care collides with hard financial limits. And in this conversation, Paul tells us, firstly, what they are seeing out there on those front lines. What's different in 2025 compared to 10 years, even 5 years ago? And, spoiler alert, this conversation about affordability of care has never been more relevant. But then we talk solutions. How does a charity like the Blue Cross make it work? And what can we, as for-profit businesses, learn from them about pragmatic care? This was one of those episodes that made me sit back and rethink how we define value in veterinary care, not just for our clients, but also for ourselves. Let's get into it with Dr. Paul Magtelow. I want to ask you a question that I didn't prep you for. It's a statement that I hear often in the vet world, and I'd love to hear what you think about it when you hear this. When people say, owning a pet is a privilege, it's not a right. Don't own a pet if you can't afford it. Vets love saying that.
Yeah, absolutely. I've heard that. I mean, I've worked in the charity sector for over 2 decades now. Alongside that, I've also worked in private practice, so I can see things from both sides of sort of society's spectrum, if you like. And I would say that, yes, there is an element of responsibility that people have to have when they do acquire pets. And, you know, the responsibility to meet their needs. And one of those needs is veterinary care. And we know veterinary care is expensive. But what we're increasingly seeing in today's world is people that find themselves in unfortunate circumstances through no fault of their own, all of a sudden find themselves in situations where they really can't afford the basics of their own existence, never mind a pet. So I think it's an easy statement to make, but I think there are specific societal challenges all across the world at the moment, which we have to acknowledge. And then also, I do believe that pets do bring so much to people's lives. And for some people, especially people who are suffering from social isolation, who are unable to work and are in really difficult situations, pets actually have a great way of building up their confidence, maintaining connection with the outside world and giving them a sense of responsibility. So I think over the years, I've seen situations where I absolutely have seen the benefits that a pet can bring to a person who could not afford them.
See, the reason I ask that question and what's always bugged me about that statement, I bristle a bit when I hear it for exactly the reasons that you say. Some of the people you and I have met in our careers who've loved their pets the most will pay what they can pay, but they can't necessarily afford it. But it's really important I think, for them to have that creature in their life, that companion. And also, where do you draw the line with what does afford mean? Don't have a pet if you can't afford it. What, afford food and water, or afford vaccinations, or afford TPLO surgery? What defines affording it?
You're absolutely right. And, you know, I've got a dog. And when I look at some of the more advanced medical and surgical procedures that we can offer now, I would struggle to afford some of those at referral.
It's because you're a veterinarian, Paul.
Yeah, well, exactly. That's a career choice. But I mean, when you look at what is affordable, I can absolutely, my dog's called Rodney, and I can absolutely meet his day-to-day needs. I've got him insured and up to a limit. And I feel that I am in a really privileged position that I can afford to have a dog and meet his needs. But if something were to happen and he did need some sort of advanced medical or surgical procedure that runs into tens of thousands of pounds, I would really struggle and would probably have to make a decision about whether or not I would be willing to get into debt, for example, to pay for that. So I think it is all relative. And when the unexpected happens, nobody can budget for that unless you are in an incredibly privileged and wealthy position.
So Rodney's not necessarily getting a new mitral valve when his mitral valve goes.
Well, I did a DNA test on him, and he's 12 terriers and a chihuahua, we call him. So he's 12 different terriers and 3% chihuahua. So if there is ever a sort of a Heinz 57 dog, it is him. But he is terrier through and through. And touch wood, he's 4 years old now, and he's never had any health problems whatsoever. But I think it's another challenging one, isn't it, about the sort of breed of dog you get and the likelihood of them to have health problems, and how you can mitigate that at the point of acquiring a pet to make sure you do protect yourselves against some of those unexpected costs. And you never can completely, but the choice of your pet is important.
Yeah, if somebody makes the statement, don't get a French bulldog unless you can afford it, I'm 100% behind that statement. No criticism of
Absolutely.
that. Paul, I would love to find out about your world. You come at the vet profession because of your role at Blue Cross from a different perspective, possibly different worldview. And as you say, you have both worldviews. First, a little bit of background. UK vets know what Blue Cross is. The rest of us might not know. Could you give us a bit of a rundown? What is the Blue Cross? How does it operate? And I know you also at the PDSA previously. If we can talk to that, is it a similar thing? How do they differ? What does charity veterinary science look like in the United Kingdom?
I sort of cut my teeth, as it were, as a vet in the charity sector at PDSA. I was there for 19 years, and that's where I really cut my teeth, if you like, in veterinary. And the charity hospitals in the UK generally work on this sort of primary care plus model. So the clients that come can't generally afford referral. So particularly your surgery is leaning towards that referral model. So most of the vets that work in charity are pretty good at doing fracture repairs and various advanced surgeries. But you are working in a sort of a pragmatic environment. So you are really looking at clinical evidence. It's a lot of pattern recognition. It's a lot of common things are common sort of approach. You're not chasing diagnosis. You're looking at prognosis primarily. And, there's not an aversion to attempting treatment rather than pursuing multiple sort of diagnostics. And I worked my way up into a leadership role at PDSA. I was regional director looking after all the hospital operations in the south side, about 15 hospitals, was overseeing the veterinary service across the whole south of England, Wales and Northern Ireland. And then this role came up at Blue Cross as the director of veterinary services. And Blue Cross is a really interesting charity. It's very similar in that it's got a very long history, over 125 years. And I really like that. I like the fact that these organisations are rooted in strong history. There was lots of links to helping out animals in the war as well, it's a really nice feel-good element to the work. But it was interesting to see how the charity had evolved. And the reason I went to Blue Cross was because it wasn't just focused on veterinary services. There's 6 core services at the charity, which include rehoming and fostering, behaviour and veterinary. They're the pet services, if you like. But then there was also some people services like pet loss support, pet food banks and education. And it just felt a little bit more holistic, because I think when you're working in veterinary sometimes, especially in the charity sector, you do feel that you're helping to fix one part of the problem. And particularly at the moment, we're seeing really complex behavioural needs in dogs, for example. Now, as a veterinary surgeon in practice, you have limited impact on the ability to address that. So now working for a charity that looks at the whole life cycle of the pet was really, really appealing to me. And the fact that the charity was also in a position that it could respond to sort of crises that come up, which is how the Pet Food Bank service was set up in the cost of living crisis. But also we had a really active part in Ukraine as well. When the war was announced in Ukraine, we did a huge amount of fundraising for that and was able to really target funds to supporting the abandoned pets through charities that were working in that region. So you feel like you're doing a lot more, if you like, over the whole life cycle of the pet and addressing the multiple different problems that we're seeing with pets in the UK at the moment.
I love that approach. The more, as you say, the more holistic approach. There's the parable or the metaphor where people say most problem solving is rescuing the drowning people as they come past you in the river. But the sensible approach is to go upriver and see, well, why is everybody falling in the river in the first place, and stopping them from starting to drown. So really great. I did a bit of research about the Blue Cross before this interview. I like the rebranding. Could you tell us the original name of Blue Cross back in the old days? Do you know?
Yeah, that was well before my time. It was Dumb Friends League, wasn't it? Or something along those lines.
Our Dumb Friends League was like, I think that they changed it. Could get confusing who exactly they were referring to.
But do you know what? It's really interesting that actually, because it really does indicate as well how society has changed in its view of pets. And even in my career, I'm sure you'll appreciate this. We were talking about a relationship between pets and owners about sort of 20 years ago. And now we're talking about fur babies and pet parents. So the whole dynamic between ourselves and the pets that are living with us has completely changed. And I think that has implications on things like, veterinary care and the choices that people are making for the pets. So it is a really interesting sort of observation, isn't it? But we're seeing it, especially since the pandemic as well. We're seeing a whole new generation of pet owners that have come into the market, if you like, that have very different relationships with their animals.
So funding wise, because again, when we talk, this conversation is inherently going to be a lot about money, pet care and money, and the conflict that exists between the two. Where does the Blue Cross and PTSA, for that matter, where do you get money from? Who pays for the treatments?
Yeah, so I suppose we're quite lucky in the UK. The charity concept is very sort of well established and people like to donate to charities. There are challenges with that in the current financial environment, but generally most charities and the animal charities will go out for sort of major donors, so people who want to donate to a cause. The majority of fundraising in the UK, I would suggest, comes from legacies. That's people who leave money to charities in their wills. Obviously, your sort of fundraising initiatives like going to shows and engaging people with the cause and what we do, and people that want to regularly donate. I mean, it's become quite a thing over the last few years where you can just leave a couple of pounds to a charity every month in your sort of direct debit. But actually, when you get a few hundred people that sign up to that, it can generate substantial amounts of money. But I would say about half of our income comes from legacies still. And what we find is it's often people who have had an experience with the charity that have, we've treated their pet at a time of crisis in their life, and so they leave a gift in their will, or they've rehomed a pet from us and they've had a good experience. When I'm in a position to, I want to give something back. So it's almost that full circle moment.
And then do the clients pay anything? Because I know when I spent my 3 years in the UK, it was interesting. We don't have anything like this in Australia, but our little practice out in West Wales was affiliated with the PTSA, and we got some money for certain people. People have to register, and then they could get a certain level of vet care funded by the PTSA. But if I recall, they still paid something. Like they had to pay like a monthly subscription fee or something. I can't remember. Do they pay at all, or is it just for free?
Yeah, so historically, treatment has been free. Now, you've got to remember, these are people that are deemed as the poorest in society. Okay. So these are people that have to be eligible to use our services. They have to be on sort of state-awarded benefits. But obviously, the cost of running a veterinary service are escalating. Yeah. I mean, between 2023 and 2028, our forecasting is a rise in £2 million in cost. That's base cost. That's not doing anything, changing our service, not investing in infrastructure or staffing. For how many
hospitals? Remind me, I don't know if you said, how many hospitals have you got?
That's for 4 hospitals. Okay. So that's putting our running costs from 10.2 million up to 12.2 million, which is a substantial increase. And so last year we introduced, so actually it was in 2021, actually, we looked at another section of society. I always think of society in layers. We have the poorest in society that we gave free treatment for. There was another group of people that were also on benefits, but weren't deemed as poor by the benefit system. So a lot of those people might be receiving in-work benefits. And we started opening the service up to them. They paid, but at a highly subsidized rate. So we've almost got this sort of two-tier service that we offer. But in last year, we were looking at our financial modeling. So we started charging all clients a consultation fee. Again, highly subsidized, but that would be at the point they access the care, and then the surgery for this band of clients would still be free in an emergency situation. We're constantly having to look at our sort of pricing models. However, what I would say is that all clients would be expected to contribute towards their pet's treatment, even if they receive something for free. And we do get a lot of contributions from our clients. It's really positive that people are demonstrating they do want to pay something. They're just in the circumstances where they can't pay the whole bill. But we look at this really, and, charities have had to become very business minded over the past couple of decades. There is not money falling off trees for us, so we have to run our services incredibly efficiently. We have to budget for even the contributions that are given, so our teams work really hard to generate those. And then we have to budget on pet numbers. It's become an incredibly efficient budgeting process in order to help the pets that we need to in the communities that we serve, but also generate the income that we need to make our services sustainable.
I have to come back to the efficiency. I want to double click on that at some point. Like how do you do it? How do you make it viable to provide a decent level of care on such a tight budget? But for now, I'd love to just get an indication of what you are seeing. Let's say the veterinary profession, the animal care profession is Paul's patient, and you've got your hands in its inguinum, feeling the pulse of the animal care profession. Or maybe you're doing a rectal exam. What are you feeling? What's your vibe from your vantage point on what's happening in the world of veterinary science and pet care?
I think we're in a little bit of trouble, if I'm going to be honest. And it's, I love this profession. I'm a vet through and through, but I think we're in a little bit of trouble in terms of how the profession is feeling and how it's perceived. So you probably heard in the UK, the Competition and Markets Authority are investigating veterinary services in the UK and whether or not pet owners are being given adequate sort of options, and whether the emergence of corporates has affected people's choices in terms of access to care and the affordability of it as well. And that's not been great, because that's really shone a light. And the media, of course, get hold of these sorts of stories and have painted the veterinary profession as, rip-off merchants. And that's not been great in terms of public trust. However, I would say that when you look at pet owners, pet guardians and their views on the profession, it's still relatively positive, I would say. If you look at social media, it looks like everybody jumps in and says, I've had to pay this much for a blood test and it's disgusting and vets are a rip-off and they're all driving around in amazing cars, which we all know in the profession is not the case. But there's a risk there of that sort of public trust. But I think, and especially since the pandemic, I think there's been this narrative in the profession that we are in this cycle of sort of burnout and dropout, and there's a mental health crisis in the profession. And we keep seeing these emerging statistics of, the increased rate of suicide and all these things. So I do worry about new grads coming into the profession, seeing all this and thinking, oh God, our expectation is that this is going to be really, really tough. It's going to be hard talking about money. It's going to be hard trying to convince somebody that I'm not trying to sort of rip them off, I don't have their pet's interests at heart. And it does feel like the narrative is playing into this a little bit. I don't think it's as bad as it looks from the outside. I think there's still really, really great work going on. I think there's still some fantastic people engaged in the profession. But I think there's a lot of spotlight on our profession at the moment, and I'm sure you're seeing similar things in your part of the world. But there's a lot going on at the moment. I think if you just looked at the headlines, it would seem like a bleak place.
It is. And I'm with you that I feel like a lot of that's just what the media and social media does. It loves a bit of outrage and a bit of clickbait. So it gets attention. So maybe it isn't a bit of an echo chamber that, oh, this is so bad. And down on ground level, it's not necessarily that bad. But very often where there's smoke, there's fire. When you and I have been vets for about the same amount of time, and I spent my time in the UK many moons ago. I can't even remember how long. Has it changed? Do you think work as a veterinarian in terms of those things that we're talking about has changed for the worse or better, or just the same as always?
I would say it does feel a little bit different. I used to love sort of consulting. I mean, I was a surgeon at heart, but I used to sort of, in that really sort of efficient, let's go out and get through the list really quickly. And obviously I'm a little bit older now and I don't do as much clinical work, but I find consulting quite tricky. Now I think that there's so much more fear in terms of missing things and client expectations. And I feel like when I first graduated, I worked in various different areas. And one of the first places I worked in Leeds in the north, which is where I'm from. And the people in that area didn't have a lot of money. And I felt like it was a bit easier in a way because people were a bit more pragmatic around keeping their pets. And like I said, we referred back to this before, dogs were dogs and cats were cats. And if they developed a condition, people would often say, well, I don't want to put them through that, or I don't have the money for that. And it was a much easier conversation than what I find we're in now, because even with charitable clients, their expectations are a lot higher. Medical, surgical treatment has advanced so much, and I'm absolutely all for that. I think it's fantastic what we can now do in the profession. But when you see these sort of TV shows that show animals getting prosthetic legs or having major spinal surgery, and they don't talk about costs whatsoever, then your average sort of pet owner is coming into you and saying, well, but I want that. And you're like, okay, but that's a referral level procedure. This estimate between £10,000 and £15,000. And there's this level of outrage that like, well, that's disgusting. And you're like, but that's what it costs. And I've never, ever really commented on the cost of veterinary care. I think veterinary services are businesses generally, and I think people should be able to charge what they want in their business, but justifying it against a value proposition is really, really important. And I always used a supermarket analogy for this. We've got lots of supermarkets in the UK. You might have heard of M&S and Marks and Spencer's and Waitrose. And they're at sort of the top end. You pay a lot more for your products there. Yep. At the lower end, we've got emergence of a lot of these German sorts of really efficient supermarkets like Aldi and Lidl. And in those, you queue at the checkouts, they throw your shopping at you. They don't even, you don't even get time to pack it. And the cost is a lot lower, but you know what you're getting. It's like picking a flight. If you go with a high-end flight carrier, you pay more, but you expect a level of service. Similarly, at that budget end as well. But what we're not very good at in the world of veterinary is defining that value proposition and clients understanding that this is a budget service you're getting here, or this is a very high-end service. And that differentiation just doesn't seem to be there. So people's expectations can often be very different to the service that they're being offered. And I think also that we're struggling as a profession to have really sensible conversations about costs, about quality of life. And there is this real aversion to talking about euthanasia, which I think is a real challenge, and it's sort of causing us problems, I think, in offering treatment options to clients.
Do you find that even in your work in the charity sector? Because I would imagine that when I rock up at Blue Cross Hospital, my expectation is that I'm not an M&S, I'm definitely an Aldi. Is that or not? Do you still find that people want the luxury experience, or are they more pragmatic?
No, absolutely. I mean, I would say the majority of our clients who are absolutely incredibly grateful for the service that we offer. And I think that because we really do have a very strong sort of veterinary standards team who have looked at the level of scope of service we offer, it doesn't feel like an Aldi, I would say. I would say when I walk into a Blue Cross hospital, it does feel a little, and I've said primary care plus before. However, sometimes it gets very busy. There's a long wait in the waiting room. I would expect that if I was going to a charity hospital and I had to wait for sort of 40 minutes to be seen, that would be part of the expectation. But you still get people that are, well, I've been waiting 40 minutes, when am I going to be seen? But I think that expectation level, that happens across all levels of practice. I mean, I used to finish work on a Friday at a charity hospital in East London, And then I'd go to work on a Saturday in Belgravia, which is a very well-heeled part of London, and have exactly the same conversations with the clients there about expectations, about cost of treatment. So I think it's all relative, to be honest.
Talk to me about the other side of because when you and I talk about the animal care veterinary profession and all of our listeners, it's from the vet perspective, but there's another side to it. There's the client perspective. Are you seeing patterns in your work, how things are changing for our clients, not our patients? As you say, we're getting much better at treating our patients, but what's it like from the other side?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? And I think what we're seeing is we're getting clients who are bringing pets into us that are much sicker. People are delaying routine sort of treatments, and a lot of pets have been referred to us from neighbouring practices where the clients have sort of run out of money. But I think there is a bit more fear for pet owners to take their pets to a vet for obvious reasons that we've talked about. There's a lot in the media about how expensive veterinary care is. And I recently had to go on the BBC and talk about a journalist that got hold of a story that more pets were being put to sleep because of rising vet care costs. It was a really challenging interview from the journalist, who was really sort of going for the profession really and saying, well, this is really unethical, isn't it? You would put a dog to sleep with a broken leg if the owner couldn't afford it. It's really challenging going interviews like this when the profession's been portrayed as this sort of unethical, money-grabbing people, when actually what the journalist was failing to understand was this animal with a broken leg has got a serious welfare concern. This is not a healthy animal, and we have to do something. But I think when the general public are hearing things like this or seeing headlines like that, they're worried, they're scared that they're going to be hit with big bills. So they're delaying treatment, and that's having consequences ultimately on the welfare of the pet, but on the ultimate cost of what they will end up paying, because the condition obviously progresses. So I think there is something around access to vet care. There's also something around the sort of, I referenced the new generation of pet owners that we've seen since the pandemic and where they access information. And there's some research showing that trends are going towards internet and influencers as the main source. That does concern me, that vets are not being the trusted source of information anymore. And there are some vets out there that are really jumping on that and doing some great work in the social media space, which is fantastic to see. But most vets who work in practice, they haven't got the time or the inclination to do that. So I do worry that certain influencers are stepping into the space that vets should be occupying in terms of information and advice. And you're definitely seeing in the pet nutrition space, you're seeing all sorts of self-proclaimed professionals giving lots of advice on things which will ultimately impact our profession and the reputation of it and the trust within it. But it's interesting, isn't it? So where people are going for information and how they feel about taking the pets into the vets, and how that relationship of just pre-pandemic, we saw people that were, generational pet owners. We'd seen their parents and their grandparents with their dogs. We'd seen them with multiple pets through their lifetime. They were bonded to practices. That's not the case anymore. I think the dynamics of veterinary services are changing. You're also seeing people that might go to one practice for their preventative care because it's cheaper there, and if the pet gets sick, they might take them to another one. So we don't have that client bonded sort of concept that we had before. And I think we need to adapt to that as a profession. I think we need to accept that we offer a service, and we should set ourselves up to do that to the best of our ability.
That's a huge one. You're right. There's some scary things happening out there in that regard. I had a conversation at a conference once with a guy who does owner education, pet education. That's his business. They put on big webinars and then they get advertising. And they obviously want as many people to attend as possible. And he said they started with getting veterinarians as speakers, the experts, to host these webinars. The numbers were okay. And then they tried alternative health people, and then suddenly they like 10x people attending. You're like, why are we so bad at it? Why did people, are we boring, or are people just generally anti-science? There's definitely that sort of trend. I feel like COVID had a big hand in that. We're like, well, we're in the pocket of the big food manufacturers and big pharma, and we're just taking kickbacks, and you can't trust science, so let's talk to the guy on Instagram.
Well, it's really interesting you say that. I went to a sort of a convention a couple of weeks ago run by RCVS Knowledge, which is looking at this concept of contextualized care, which is an emerging sort of, it's a buzzword in the UK at the moment. And it's how do we offer care to patients based on, the owner's circumstances, finances, the needs of the patient, the welfare, all that sort of stuff. Now, for me, it feels a little bit common sense. It's what we should be doing anyway, but it feels like the profession's almost lost its way a little bit, and we need to instill some more of these skills, how to offer things in a much more sort of contextualized way. And there was this whole conversation about educating clients and pet owners. And it was just really interesting because it just felt like a load of vets talking about what clients need to be educated on. And I made the point, and I just say, why don't we ask the people sat around the table? Because they did have pet owners there. And I said, we should be leading in with, what do you need? Rather than, right, we're the experts. We're going to now create this whole set of resources on what pet owners need in order to provide better care for their pets. And so it is a little bit of the problem with the profession that there's almost this paternalistic relationship with our clients. And if you draw back a little bit into the concept of business and any sort of service delivery, any business will tell you that you offer your service according to the needs of your customers. That is exactly what you do. And the insight comes from your service users. It doesn't come from your professionals delivering the service. We have to adapt to what our consumers need. And I think because the world of pet ownership is changing so much, I think we need to adapt as a service to meet the needs of the people that are going to be coming to us in years to come. And then just a really simple one is communication, for example. I mean, the world of communication has changed absolutely massively. And a lot of practices are getting on board with that. Clients don't want to phone and speak to somebody. They want to send a WhatsApp message. But if we are meeting our customers, our clients, our pet owners where they are, then we're going to be much more effective at delivering better healthcare to the patients that we're serving. And, even in the world of human healthcare, it's a lot easier because the patient is also the customer. We've got that additional challenge that, we need to try and get access to our patients through a person who ultimately is the person that's paying for our services and who we have the relationship with.
Yeah. So back to the clients and their experience, because you talk about they are worried. They don't want to come to us because they're worried they're going to get stung with a big bill. But are you guys seeing, well, I know you are. I looked at the Blue Cross website, and you've got a massive increased demand for people who can't afford vet bills. So it's also not just a perceived fear. There's a genuine cost of living crisis as well. So we've got increasing vet fees on the one side and then less disposable income on the other side. Is that a real thing that you guys are experiencing?
Yeah, so in 2023, I set up a veterinary care fund, which was really, I saw the cost of living crisis that was coming out of not just the pandemic, but the war in Ukraine, which was having a massive impact in terms of economics in the UK with sort of shockwaves across the world. And I looked at, okay, we need to steady ourselves for this. We need to acknowledge the fact that across the UK, there are going to be people that don't have access to charity services that are going to be really, really struggling to pay for veterinary care in their pets. And at Blue Cross, we've got a vested interest in this because remember, we've got a national rehoming network as well. So if people have to relinquish pets, we see the impact of that as well. So it was almost this preventive measure of how do we keep people and pets together. So we had some funding to look at, can we look at a national fund that would help people who are going into private practices around the country, all over the country, and who couldn't afford to pay their full bill. And we would contribute towards that. Now, there was some boundaries around that. It had to be pragmatic treatment. We weren't going to be funding, these huge diagnostic workups that didn't end up in a result. And if it was helping to fund surgery, it would be curative, and there would be some quality of life measures and improved welfare expectations. But it was all vet driven. Mm-hmm. And before we looked at this, we had about 23 practices across the UK that regularly requested help. Is there any funding that we can help this client through? And in the space of about 18 months, we've got over 1,700 practices now signed up for this fund across the UK. Now, what this tells me is that this problem is national. We now cover 93.5% of UK postcodes with this fund. So what that's telling us is that there are people going into pretty much every practice across the UK that are falling into financial hardship. And it was a really interesting, it's giving us lots of data as well. What is really good is that we did no marketing for this fund. This was just word of mouth from vets speaking to vets and saying, hey, look, I think the Blue Cross is helping people that are struggling to afford their bills. And what it was very clear is that vets were really doing their best. So we did some audits of these cases and we continually audit them and we're coming through. These are vets that are really trying to push costs down for owners already and are really taking pragmatic approaches. But these are people that are just faced in this situation. And even in postcodes where you would expect, clients to be relatively wealthy, there are still people within them. So we did some poverty mapping, and it's very clear in the UK. If you split household income into thirds, so you've got the wealthy third, the middle third, and the lowest third. The wealthiest third are sort of fine, that their disposable income is kind of staying the same, if not going slightly up. But it's this lower third that are really concerning. That's a third of all UK households. Their disposable income is going down, and it is continuing to go down year on year on year. Now, these are not necessarily people that are in the benefit system in the UK. These are people that are working. These are people that have families, and a lot of these people have pets. So the Veterinary Care Fund that we set up was really to address that, the people that fall outside the catchment of our hospitals, outside of eligibility criteria for charity help, and they're struggling. They're really, really struggling. And it does point to a little bit of a welfare crisis, I think, because it doesn't look like it's improving. People are getting poorer, and that's just a fact.
How do you vet those people? Excuse the pun. How do you decide who gets access to that fund? Because again, they're not officially, because I remember with the PDSA, you had to be on benefits already, government benefits. So there was that.
Yeah.
What determines this?
So we have a similar sort of eligibility criteria to access our hospitals. But with the Veterinary Care Fund, we sort of have empowered the vets in practice to assess that for us. That we don't ask them to check benefits at all. I think the whole process of asking people to produce documents to prove that you're poor isn't great. I've never really liked it, but we do have a responsibility to manage our funds appropriately. But we simply ask the vets and say, is this client unable to afford the treatment that you're providing? And what we're finding is that vets are actually very good gatekeepers of that. Okay. There is a real sense of responsibility that, I'm accessing a charity's help. There are some steps you have to go through. Obviously, it's not simple, but we have made it relatively simple. It's the vets that are the ones that we trust to determine that for us. And when we get the testimonials from the clients that have accessed their funds, it's very, very clear that those people are very deserving of these funds. And we're getting some stories through which they're just heartbreaking. We've got people that husband has had a stroke and he's just lost his job, and the family were going to have to give this pet up, but we gave them some money, and it's not a huge amount of money. The maximum amount that we'll award is £300, and it's usually towards a treatment cost. We're not paying for usually the whole lot. Okay. But we are definitely keeping pets and families together, so it's hugely rewarding for that respect. But it's a limited pot of money. You could give me £5 million right now, and I would run out of that at the end of the year for this fund, because the problem is global at the moment. And I'm hoping that the situation will improve in the UK, but it's a concern.
Is there a sensible response to that beyond just more fundraising, finding more money to help people? Like, what do you guys do? How are you responding to it? And what do we as a wider profession do about this? Because the big thing from my perspective in this conversation, this is your job, right? Charity work, that is literally your job. But in private practice, we still, and especially in Australia, we don't have and I don't know about the States, but here it's definitely not as well established. It's very often there's no tap out, that I am the last line of defense. I'm like, well, if you can't afford my care, you can go try another practice, but they're probably going to tell you the same stuff. You shit out of luck. Sorry. So my question is, what do we do on the floor as GP practitioners or business owners to address this problem?
Yeah, and the challenge it's really not as simple as going out and doing some more fundraising. I wish it were. Yeah. We've got fundraising teams that are working incredibly hard. The fundraising environment is getting more and more challenging. There are less people able obviously to donate to charities. And that's the problem. And we're having to look very closely at the services we can offer, because ultimately we can't invent money. We have some reserves. We're dipping into them on an annual basis at the moment, but to be financially sustainable for the long term, we have to look at what is possible. So there is that challenge. But I think on a sort of an individual level, we've all got a responsibility in terms of what we do with the patient that's in front of us. And if we've got to think of that patient's welfare, and we've got to think and advocate for that pet. And I think that what I would urge veterinary practitioners across the world to think about is that there isn't anybody that's able to come and rescue this for you. When that problem's in front of you, you're going to have to help that owner make the decisions that are appropriate for their pet. And if that means going for sort of more pragmatic options, if that means being very realistic about the prognosis of that pet, if that means thinking about euthanasia, because the other thing as well is that people go, you know, let's get the pet signed over and let's get them to a rehoming centre. And you see requests for rehoming centres to take on animals that have got complex medical and surgical problems that need fixing at a cost to the charity, with little chance of these animals getting rehomed. So I think that we have to, as a profession, acknowledge that at some point something's got to give, and supporting an owner through that difficult decision is sometimes in the best interest of the animal at that time.
It's tough to ask, because you're right, and that is, again, for our generation, that is just part and parcel of the job. Is, yeah, sometimes I have to be cruel to be kind, not cruel to the animal, but not do what I'd love to do and have a difficult conversation with an owner. Increasingly, I do hear a call. Who did I speak to? I spoke to somebody at a conference the other day. Somebody from Western Australia with an association with the local government. Actually training social workers to work in vet hospitals to have these conversations, because they are saying it's not really fair for the veterinarians to have this level of conversation, get into your money problems and your psychological problems and your home life, and mesh that with the healthcare of the pet. It's a heavy burden to carry for individual veterinarians. Do you guys have, like, is it tough for your vets, for you working in a charity service? Is it harder? Or is it more draining, or is it actually fulfilling? And how do you get better at those sort of conversations?
Yeah, it's a really great question, isn't it? And a lot of the clients, by definition, when you are dealing with a poor demographic in society, will be coming with sort of complex needs themselves, and very complex and sometimes heartbreaking home situations. But I think we are there to advocate for the pets. That is our role in any, whatever practice you're working at, whatever area. That is our main priority, is the welfare of that pet. But like you say, you do have to contextualize that sometimes in the owner's circumstances as well. And I've seen situations where in a different circumstance, the decision for that pet might have been different. And I get that. And that can be tough for vets. But we are also working within the constraints of the world that's presented in front of us as well. I think sometimes it's really interesting because historically charity vets might not have had to have those financial conversations and can just crack on and do the treatment. So they struggle a little bit sometimes with the financial element of it, as much as people in private practice. When we introduced charging for consults, so the sort of tier of service that we offered, the vets do struggle with it a little bit, but it's the reality of the world that we live in. We offer a service and it comes at a cost. So we've got to get better at it, I think, as a profession. I think for me, and I did have a really interesting conversation with a pet owner at this conference that I just talked about, and they did some research as well and showed the sort of things that people really are really interested in. For pet owners, it's the main thing that they care about is the quality of life of their pet during treatment and their quality of life after as well. Is their pet going to suffer, or are they going to cope with the treatment that's been proposed, and what is it going to be like afterwards? And that's something that didn't come up very highly on the veterinary surgeon survey, which was interesting. And I think that when we go into these conversations, quality of life for me is probably one of the most important things. And prognosis over diagnosis is something that I've always been really passionate about. Before we start embarking on these invasive and costly treatment options, can we just pause a minute and think about, okay, what is that pet's welfare and quality of life going to be like during and afterwards? And if it's not meeting the client's expectations and it can't meet their circumstances, then is it really the right thing to do? because we're seeing a lot at the moment of pets that have gone down some quite aggressive treatment therapies. The owners have run out of money and they've been referred to us. And in hindsight, it wasn't the right decision. And that's not great because it really does put that owner in not only a difficult emotional position, but they lose a lot of trust as well with vets. So yeah, it's an interesting conundrum to have.
Yeah, how do you get better at that? Let's say we've got a younger vet or less experienced vet listening to this, and it's great to hear that institutions like the Royal College are addressing this, and I know it's a big thing in the States of, well, the spectrum of care. But how do you get better at the front end of that conversation to go, all right, well, before we do all these things, let's talk about where this is heading?
Yeah, and there's another thing that's thrown into the mix now, isn't it, as we've talked about, is the relationship that person has with that animal as well. And I've made some sort of false assumptions in my time that when I'm working at one of these very wealthy areas with very well-heeled owners, that they want to do everything that they can. And I've been caught short sometimes by people have been saying, "Oh no, I'm not going to put a dog through that. I'm not going to pay for that. That's ridiculous." So I think it's that there's another complex thing there in what are people prepared to pay? But over the years, and when you work at a senior level, you get visibility of all the complaints that come in. And the majority of complaints that we get in veterinary practice are either down to communication or down to not being upfront about the costs of treatment. Very rarely is there much substance in the actual treatment itself. It's generally about the communication of it. I mean, obviously there are exceptions to that and things happen. But my advice would always be just be very upfront about A, what are people prepared to pay? And B, what are they prepared to do as well? People don't necessarily always want to put their pets through prolonged treatment courses with not great outcomes. And whereas on the flip side of it, people will do everything they can to give their pet another couple of weeks of life. So you've got to be really, really clear what the owner's expectations of that treatment is and whether or not the treatment is going to match it. But as I say, being very honest and open about the owner's budget is super important, I find. And it's something I learned very quickly in private practice, that you have to understand how much they're prepared to pay. There was a bit of an uptake in insurance, I understand, last year in the UK. And I think about 4 million pets are insured now, which is relatively high. But there's 36 million pets in the UK.
Oh, wow.
So,
Wow.
You know, there's about 10, 11 million dogs and cats, but then there's a lot of other sort of exotic pets and smaller pets. But the majority of pets, therefore, are not insured. I heard colleagues when I was working in this private practice, the first question they asked is your pet insured? And that was almost the finance conversation done. And I used to hear that and I'm like, yeah, but what's their insurance limit? Like what's their excess they've got to pay on that? That's not a financial conversation. Is it insured? Because all that's doing is giving that owner the sense that, oh, right, they're just going to charge what they want now because it's insured. That's not a proper financial conversation in my view.
Yeah. I'm curious, for those of us who do not work in a charity hospital, and this is probably more for the level of the practice owner or the management, how do we get better at it? At catering, can we? Is the current business model, the veterinary business model, capable of catering for everybody? Because if you go to a veterinary business coach, I have a lot of conversations with people, and generally the advice for private practice owners is charge more, raise your prices. You want to be at the 80th percentile of veterinary pricing. But what about the other end, and especially in places like in Australia or the rest of the world where there's not a Blue Cross or a PDSA for people who can't reach for that? Are we leaving people behind? And how do we prevent that? Let's say Paul gets fired from Blue Cross. I was going to say quit, but I don't think you're going to quit. And you start your own vet business. How would you institute this in your vet business?
This is a really interesting question, isn't it? And I'm going to start off by saying, as a business, I believe you can charge whatever you want for your services. I really, really do believe that. Whether or not your customers can afford it is another question. And I think that's the key point. And this is the bit where business models will fail, I think. And what we're seeing at the moment, across the world, is that people don't have as much disposable income. So in that model where you raise your profit just by increasing your prices, you're going to outprice some of your clients out of the market. And that's fine. If you don't want to see those clients anymore, you can just say to them, look, this is how much the cost of it are. I suggest you go somewhere else. Now, if everybody's doing that, that's not great because there's going to be a whole chunk of people in the population that have got pets that have got no access to veterinary care. So I think for me, and it's really interesting that I'm now being asked to talk at veterinary conferences on how to develop pricing models, how to run efficient practices and things like that. And I think it's a really interesting sort of gap in skills that we've now got in the profession, where we're now calling on the charities who do run efficient hospitals. And the recent talk that I gave was how to develop a cost-based pricing model rather than what we currently do in veterinary, which is value-based, or we look at what everybody else is charging in the market and set our prices relative to that. But, to answer your question, if I left Blue Cross now and set up my own practice, I'm pretty confident I could turn a profit on a budget practice model with what I've learned in the charity sector. And basically, we have to do our own pricing modeling as well. And we have to look at how we run efficiently. But if you're going to offer sort of a cheaper option service model, it has to be volume based. Okay. So what you talk about there is put your prices up. What that's doing is that's increasing your average transaction value. So for every pet that walks in the door, you're charging them more money. And that's fine. That's one way of increasing your profit. The other way of looking at it is saying, okay, if I want to offer a more sort of budget service, for example, going back to your supermarket options, well, it has to be on pet volumes. I have to see more people and I have to look at my scope of service and I have to charge them less. But you make your value or your income and your profit on. And there are actually some models in the States that are emerging that are doing that are turning a profit on budget models and also funding models where, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because the model that we've got in veterinary practice is that it's very transactional, isn't it? It's okay. So client walks in, they pay at the point of service, and we expect people to have £1,000 laying around to pay for that. I think if you look at it from the other side and you say, okay, I don't have £1,000 in my back pocket on many days of the week. It's just not something that you have. So if you assume that people come into your practice, don't have money, but could pay you over time, or could you access some funding from somewhere, or just taking a slightly different approach to how income is achieved. I've seen these practices that in the States are generating profits that are very healthy in terms of what private practices are generating. But I talked at a recent veterinary conference on a cost-based pricing model, which is what we've developed, which is, again, the common business practice. You look at all the costs of running your business. Mm-hmm. You look at all your available sort of vet and nurse hours, and then you divide one by the other and you say, well, if I'm going to charge this per vet hour, I'm going to break even. But it's absolutely grounded on evidence on this is what things cost. And I think when we've done the modelling at Blue Cross for this year's budgets, if I charge my vet time out at £150 an hour, I break even. And I think that's pretty good budget model. Obviously, we don't charge that because we get some funding in. But I think understanding your cost base is really, really important. And then you can add on whatever margin you want. But that's not kind of what we do in veterinary practice. And we do this really strange thing where, for example, neutering is always done at a discount. It's always done at a discount. It's always a loss leader. But what that's doing is it's telling the people that work in our practices, they don't understand how much these things cost for a start. And then what you're doing then is you're just putting the margin somewhere else. So you're disproportionately charging higher prices to make up for the loss that you've made there. And it's a really hard cycle to break because nobody wants to be the first practice that charges double for neutering what everybody else is charging, because we use that to get our clients and get them bonded. But if you think of a model where clients that might not be bonded to practices so much in the future, why not let people go to the practice down the road and do all the neutering down there at a loss? And then you just charge a cost-based price model plus your margin for everything else and make a healthy profit, not having to do the loss-making work. So it's a really interesting conundrum we've got ourselves into, but somebody's going to have to be brave and break the mold, I think, and actually just say, actually, no, this is how much things cost. I'm just going to add in a bit of a margin. And medicines, we've completely messed ourselves up here as well, because traditionally we didn't charge for time appropriately. We put markup on treatments. So some of these medicines have got 1,000% markup on them. And of course, the internet pharmacies have emerged and they're doing things way cheaper than we can. So again, it doesn't look great. And it's not a model that I think a lot of businesses have adopted. It's an interesting problem we've got.
Figuring out your cost of delivering a service, is it as complicated as it sounds? Because I've run an emergency service and there's a lot of moving parts to keep in mind. It's literally from How much electricity am I paying per hour? Cleaning things, or like how much work is it for the Blue Cross to figure this out? Or is there a simple recipe or a resource that people can go to?
Establishing the cost is easy. That's the easy bit. You just roll in what you've spent. Okay. That's the easy bit. I think the difficult bit is to then look at how much individual procedures are going to cost. And let's be honest, the majority of costs in a veterinary practice are staff time. That is the majority of things that any business owner is paying for, or charity. That is the fact. So that's the biggest focus, really. The tricky bit then comes in about how you then charge out for things. How long does what is the cost of doing this procedure, for example? How much time is it going to take? What are the consumables in there? All that sort of stuff. I mean, we do something simple. We just roll all our costs of consumables, overheads, rates, electricity, rents, all that sort of stuff into one big thing. And we've got our full sort of cost base. How you then apportion it out per hour of time is a little bit more tricky. That takes a bit of modelling. But we've got some amazing modelers and financial spreadsheets that would break the internet, the size and scale of them. But we managed to do it. You only have to do it once. And you get a relative idea of how much things cost you to do, and then you could decide what margin you put on them. So it's a big piece of work initially, but it sets yourself up. And every year, all you have to do is tweak it, and it's a lot easier after that point. We're getting into cost models now, which is...
Yeah, you're right. I find it interesting. I have so many conversations with people at all different levels of the vet profession, including owners of large corporate groups who are struggling with these issues. So...
Look, it was really interesting. I did that talk at the veterinary conference in January last year on a cost-based model, how to build sustainable pricing models. And I just, you get that fear sometimes when you're, am I overstepping the mark here? Why is a charity vet walking into a room full of practice owners, telling them how to price their services? And you know what? It was so well received. I had loads of people coming up to me afterwards and asking me, could you give me a hand? Because what people were saying, which was, again, really interesting, the problem this woman was saying to me, the biggest problem I have is my staff do not understand the cost of delivering services. So what they're doing, and she gave a really good example, is an animal's came in with a pyometra. Now, as a practice, they were charging about £1,200 for that procedure. But what the team were doing was giving antibiotics to that pet for a few days, and then booking it in for a routine neutering, which was £350. And she said, I just cannot get them to understand that neuter is £1,200. It's the same price as what I'm doing the pyometra for. And I just said to her, well, you know what the problem is, don't you? Like, the problem is that you're charging the wrong amount for that neutering procedure. And yes, I get it. There'd be uproar in the practice if all of a sudden you tried to charge. And neutering is the really interesting thing, because when we looked at our pricing at Blue Cross, we used to do free neutering at Blue Cross, and we introduced neutering charges for all our clients, because my feeling was, well, actually, there's loads of options for neutering out there. There's lots of private practices that are doing it at a loss. I'm happy for our clients to go and do it there if it's cheaper. But the bit that the veterinary teams feel really passionate about is really interesting, because they see it as a really important sort of preventive, welfare-focused thing. But the way I see it is, I say, but if you're going to double the price of your sick and injured pet's treatment to give this at a loss, is that okay? And it doesn't sit comfortably with me. And, the fact that her team were making really questionable clinical decisions to try and work the pricing system.
I love that. That is just so typical veterinarian. We are such Robin Hoods, really. Steal from somebody.
Steal from ourselves.
Steal from ourselves to help people. We just so badly want to help people that we'll come up with all these clever little tricks.
Yeah, but it's interesting, isn't it? Because if we're uncomfortable talking about something, that comes across as, it doesn't give confidence, does it? No. And I learned that pretty quickly, that if I went into a conversation with a client about money and I was like, oh, I'm really sorry, this is going to cost this much, it does not instill any confidence that you're charging the right amount to that client, and they don't trust that those prices are valid. So I learned pretty quickly that even if I thought some of the prices of the practices I worked in were quite expensive, I said, well, this is a fact. This is how much this costs. Are you comfortable with that? It's not whether or not I'm comfortable with it. I'm irrelevant in that conversation. I'm not the one paying the bill. But what I would see vets doing would be like, gosh, that's really expensive, isn't it? I'm not going to charge everything on this bill. And all that's doing is pushing the cost somewhere else. You're forcing the practice at that point to put costs up to balance the books. So yeah, it's a really interesting one.
Random question. How much is a sustainable profit margin? what is Paul's new business? What are you aiming for a profit margin that you think can run a vet practice sustainably?
Well, that's a really interesting question. And I know that I think a lot of practices are struggling to break even at the moment. But I think you need to make a decent amount of profit that you can then invest into the team, the practice, maintaining the building, the infrastructure, and investing in new technologies as well. I've got a number in my head because also I'm a bit of an entrepreneur and I have a couple of my own businesses, and I'd like to think that 20% is a reasonable amount. Okay. I think most of the time, the way that practices and technology and medicine is evolving, you're probably going to invest in something if you're delivering that level of profit. But I know that that's a level of profit that at the moment, I think a lot of the private sector is aspiring to. And we've seen massive increases in costs of delivering our services over the last few years, especially around staffing costs. I mean, we've been through a workforce crisis in the UK, which is, we were paying locums crazy amounts of money to keep services open at one point, and it's untenable. And fair play to locum vets. If the market's there for high paid locum shifts, go and do it. I know if I was in that position, I probably would, but the bubble burst at some point and people realised that actually, no, this isn't tenable anymore. I can't run a service while paying this amount of money out every day. So yeah, it's an interesting one. What's your version on the percentage profit one, just out of interest?
No, it's not mine so much. It's just conversations that I've had recently with people who are much more suited to have this conversation, who run big businesses or have run big businesses. 15% I've heard increasingly as a reasonable margin that can sustain a business, allow growth, while also, it's something that you can happily tell a client, right? You could say to a client, yeah, we aim for 15% pro. When they give you the, all you care about is the money conversation, then you go, no, that's not all I care about. But we do aim for 15% profit so that we can pay our staff. So yeah, I don't have my own personal insight because I know 20% has traditionally been put out there, and I know some of the corporates aim for 30. But does that push it too hard? Is that sustainable for your clients as well? So there we go.
It's really interesting, the concept of a business as well, isn't it? We're treating sick pets. And I used to get asked this question a lot by charity clients. And they used to say to me, do you think you'd ever want to be a proper vet? and you'd be like, I mean, working in a practice where I was doing sort of quite advanced orthopedics and ophthalmology procedures and things like that. And I was a little bit like, what do you mean a proper vet? I feel like I am a proper vet. And they're like, no, but get paid. Go to practice and get paid. And there was assumption that because you work for a charity, you volunteered your time and you didn't get paid. And we do pay. Obviously, our vets, there's not many people that can work for free. We don't often compete with private sector salaries, but we compete on other things like work-life balance and holidays and all that sort of stuff. And we do have to be relatively competitive. Mm-hmm. But it's just this concept of are people comfortable with a business that's set up to treat sick and injured pets that is making a profit and profiting off sick pets? It's just a concept that I think that we struggle with as a profession a little bit. I'm really comfortable with it because I know sort of how the world works. But it's just, I think just as a profession, we struggle with that a little bit as well.
It's well, we could talk for ages about this. It's something I've given a lot of thought to recently because, again, in the podcast, I talk to and think a lot about the problems in the profession and moving upstream. Where do these problems come from? And I recently read a book by Seth Godin, and the whole book is about systems and changing systems. If you want to change the outcome of a system, how do you do it and which levers you pull? And he talks about the concept that most businesses, countries, organizations are very large, complex systems that have been created over years to decades to hundreds of years sometimes. And once it's set, the system wants what the system wants. It has an output that it needs to deliver. And it will do its damnedest to give that output, and it will be very resistant to change. Because you've got all these little cogs. Every human is a node in the system that has to do its job, and it all works towards this output. And reading that book made me think about the system of the veterinary health care. And it made me wonder, what is that desired output? What is that outcome that the veterinary system works for? And I thought about it for quite a long time. And I was like, well, it's probably profit, right? Because we have businesses. A lot of people will say, no, the outcome is pet health, healthy animals, animal care. But I don't know. I feel like that's a byproduct or one of the ingredients that goes into it. But for the standard private practice, private business that started 100 and something years ago, the outcome that the system wants is still profit. And if that's true, and I'd love your thoughts, is that true? But if that is true, that is in direct opposition to what veterinarians go in for, because we don't want to go into it for the profit. We want the healthy animals. We want the pet care. So our system is set up for friction from the beginning. And I don't know the solution. Is the solution more Blue Cross, more PDSA, but it's not a profit-based outcome thing? Or is it just getting better at that friction, finding ways to reduce that friction and living with it, because that is the reality of the system?
Yeah, I think the sweet spot, isn't it, is that your end point is to achieve a profit, but it's the way that you do that. And you do that by delivering a highly patient-focused, customer-centric, welfare-centered service. And interestingly, in the UK, when I was first entering my sort of career, veterinary businesses had to be owned by veterinary surgeons.
Yeah.
Now that was something. So I think the sort of the meeting of the moons, if you like, of, okay, yes, I want to generate a profit because I own a business, but I'm actually also a vet and I'm going to do it in this way. Now, I'm not saying that all vets are great business owners. I think there is lots of conflicts there. But now there's been that sort of disconnect. Now you don't have to be a vet to own a veterinary business. So it has that created divergence on what the business is trying to achieve and what veterinary surgeons are trying to achieve. I think there's a connect that you can make there, that actually the way that we deliver a profit is through a high quality service that is meeting the needs of the pets and the people that we serve. But it is an interesting one, isn't it? But I think my experience from talking to lots of people in the profession is that they don't understand enough about the business and the pricing and how the decisions that are being made that they see reflected in some of the impacts on pets and clients. And that's creating a bit of a disconnect at the moment in the profession. And I'll give you an example. A nurse that actually works with me in another business worked in a night service, and they had to do an overhaul of their prices, and inpatient care doubled per night. And there was no explanation to the team. From her perspective, she was delivering the same service to those inpatients, and she actually disconnected at that point from that business because she was like, this is ridiculous. And the having to bear the brunt of that by trying to explain to owners, yeah, I know your pet was in last week and we charged you £500 a night. It's now £1,000 a night for inpatient care. And obviously the owners aren't going to handle it. They're going to just go elsewhere or try and look elsewhere. But with no explanation as to the rise in those costs, there's immediately now a disconnect between the business and the people that are working in that business and having to have those conversations with clients. So yeah, but I do think there is a place in the market for a affordable and accessible veterinary service. I don't think we should all just drift into this, let's all, offer the highest end gold standard care that we can, because that is not what society needs right now and never has, in my opinion. So I think there is potentially, if anybody's interested, that there would be a healthy profit to be generated in a model such as that, just as every other industry has proven it can do. Supermarkets, airlines, there is all a scale of affordability in product offerings and different value propositions. And I think that it could be done. And if I wasn't working in charity practice, I probably wouldn't be doing it. But yeah.
Do you think that could you have a tiered level of care within one business, or are those going to be separate businesses? Can the practice that offers the high end also have a lower cost service, or is it too much? Is it too different?
In theory, yes. It's a very tricky skill set for clinicians, I would say. So when I was working at PDSA, we used to outsource our out of hours. So they used to go to, private practices, and those vets would really struggle, quite understandably, between two different service models, whereby for one, you're expected to do X, Y, and Z as a minimum for every patient, and for another group of patients, again, it was evidence-based, and arguably you could say, well, actually, if you don't really need to do all that, should you be? But there was a lot of limitations on what PDSA were prepared to pay for. I guess the clinicians really struggled with it. It was quite difficult to get yourself into two different models in the space of half an hour with two different patients that are coming in. So I recognise that it's challenging for clinicians if you're trying to do a full scope of service at different value levels. But I think it's a skill that all vets should also have, because not everybody that walks into the practice is going to be able to afford everything that you can offer.
The challenge with that is always, and again, you talk about the emergency, and that's often the conundrum for emergency, because in many instances you are the only option available and it's urgent. It has to get done now. Yeah. So it does make it much harder. Where do you put yourself at the specialist level, full service bells and whistles, gold standard, versus pragmatic care? I like the word pragmatic care that you used earlier. And the problem with that is usually, again, vets being nice and conflict avoidant, we tend to then, if the option is there for the more pragmatic care, to sort of default to that, to go, well, we could do all the stuff, or we could, I wouldn't say cut corners, but aim a little bit lower. And then people will obviously go, well, I'll go the cheaper option. If they're both going to give you a good outcome, let's go for the cheaper option.
Yeah, and I would argue if you're getting the same sort of welfare outcome, then why not do that? But what you've then got to do is you've got to recognise that is taking less time, that it's using less resources. So actually, you could see more patients. And actually, if you're charging half to that client, you should be able to see another patient that you can also charge half to. And that's the whole concept of the budget model, is the fact that you're recognising that you are doing less work per patient, which allows you to see more patients. So I think that's the only way that sort of model can make the money, or have the impact in our case, which is see the pets that we want to see.
So for you guys to institute that pragmatic care, which is the norm for you, so a high level of care that's going to give good outcomes, but spending as little as possible. Are there things off the top of your head, the biggest needle movers that reduces your cost of care?
Yeah, so we have a veterinary standards team. Now, these are vets that meet once a week, and they look at our scope of service and some of the common conditions that we treat. And they've created a whole suite of sort of clinical guidelines. Now, again, what these are doing is they're looking at common sort of conditions. We go for the costly things first, obviously, because that's where you can have the biggest impact. And they look for all the evidence that's out there. So it's really important. Vets love evidence. We don't like just being told that, you don't need to do that. So they'll do a lot of sort of literature reviews, a lot of research, and look for different sort of treatment options, the welfare outcomes, and what we are comfortable with as a level of service. And I guess, I could give you an example of this. So abdominal tumours in cats, for example, is a good example. So our team looked at the outcomes of abdominal tumours in cats. And, as most people listening to this will probably be aware, they're not good.
No.
There isn't really any situation in which when you feel an abdominal tumour in a cat, it's going to end well. So on that basis, that helps us, because that would then dictate that we actually are moving into a palliative situation with that cat. We wouldn't necessarily consider even doing extensive imaging, diagnostics, biopsies, surgery, because we know that in the vast majority of those cases, that's not going to be a good outcome for that cat. So that's a really, really good example there, because that's the difference between having that conversation very early on with the owner, managing their expectations, and potentially considering something like steroid therapy as a palliative care. That's sort of a really clean-cut and simple example. But they have to go and get the evidence. So it's just looking at outcomes, welfare, implications, and some things that we do choose to do are quite expensive, I would say. And you look at the cost of treating specific cases and you're like, oh, but it means that you can really take a pragmatic view and get a good welfare outcome. And things like diabetes treatment, how often do you really need to have those pets in for blood monitoring? Or can you set up a system where the owner can self-monitor at home, or they can work on clinical signs to adjust dose rates and things like that, and you get really confident and experienced at dealing with some of these cases with minimal intervention. So I think you need the framework in the background of that, really, to be able to do that. And you need the confidence. Like, I sort of got my confidence when I went into charity practice, and I was working with, I think there was 5 or 6 other vets in the practice, and collectively they had between them probably about 150 years experience. And they would often be chatting about cases in the lunch break or the tea room, because you get breaks in charity practice as well, which is another great thing. I mean, you're busy in between those breaks. It's you work as powerhouses, but you also get a cup of tea. So you got a chance to discuss some of these cases. And I learned most of my clinical insight from these really experienced vets. And a lot of it was pattern recognition. It was like common things are common, just sensible, common sense approach to things. Yeah.
Do you guys... I'm sure you're getting interesting data from all of this, because what I immediately think, wow, it would be so interesting to compare outcomes with your hospitals for, let's say, completely fixable things. I immediately think of the cesarean section, or you mentioned biometria earlier, or more life-threatening, like a GDV or something like that. The Blue Cross version of that, what are your outcomes versus the bells and whistles emergency center with the central outline and all that sort of stuff? Are you getting way worse outcomes, or is it parity? Do you guys have the data? Because these would be amazing studies to look at.
Yeah, I mean, our outcomes are pretty good, I would say.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting is when you look at some sort of pandemic studies, and I know I was at PDSA from the start of the pandemic, then moved to Blue Cross, but we looked at the management of conditions that had been moved to remote management, and looked at whether there was any change in morbidity or mortality of certain conditions. And we looked at heart disease, and it was really interesting. There was absolutely no change in the management of those conditions when our service went fully remote, which is just brilliant for me as a vet. But it also indicates that we're just doing too much. We are, in some situations, intervening and trying to do too much stuff when the outcomes actually are very similar when we can step away a little bit. And we did some cruciate surgical outcomes, which were really good compared to wider sector data. So it's good. And we, don't necessarily do some of the high-tech surgical interventions. But then when you've got an experienced surgeon doing something day in, day out, the outcomes generally are pretty good, I would say.
Wow. Are your guidelines publicly available? They'd be so interesting to see for a private practice and to say, well, these are acceptable standards for Blue Cross. I wonder what we can institute.
Yeah, so we do have plans to share them on a wider scale. At the moment, we don't have a mechanism for that. So we're trying to develop an app and all sorts of things like that. But I think what I'd like to do with them, and especially with the practices that are partnering with us on the Veterinary Care Fund, is to really offer them up to clients that are clearly struggling with affordability, because we know that because their practices are asking for grants from us, from the charity. But a great scenario for me is, we've got a client that's come in, they've got a diabetic dog, they're struggling to afford the treatment costs. And we can say, yeah, okay, we can help with that. But hey, here's our clinical guideline on managing diabetic patients. Have a look at it. No pressure. Have a look at it and see if there's anything that you could do to drive down the cost of treating diabetic patients in clients that might not be able to afford it. And I think anything that we can do to sort of influence the ability for vets to empower them really to offer more affordable or accessible vet care is my job. My job will be done. I can retire in peace.
Let me know how I can help. I love this conversation. But I'm going to have to let you go at some point. Standard questions. Are you a podcast listener other than making your own podcast?
I am a podcast listener, yeah. I was going to ask if it was appropriate to blatantly plug my own podcast.
But you can absolutely plug it. Right?
I'll do that, but then I'll give you another podcast that I really enjoy listening to. Yeah, and so obviously my own podcast, The Consult Room, which was a lockdown project really, but I've just loved doing it. And I really sort of explore the modern world of pet care, if you like. So I go into some interesting subjects that I think are interesting, not just for veterinary professionals, but for pet owners and people that work alongside in other professions as well. Some of my favorites at the moment are, there's a journalist called Elizabeth Day that does a podcast called How to Fail. And it's great, really great. It's just celebrity interviews and stuff, but her style of interviewing is great. And then I don't really watch the news anymore. I've sort of switched off from the news for obvious reasons, but there is a podcast which is done by The Guardian in the UK. It's called In Focus, and that's the only sort of news sort of podcast to listen to, because it's really short, 30 minutes, gives you a really nice balanced overview of some of the biggest subjects that are going on and topics around the world at the moment. So yeah, they're my two. A bit of entertainment and a bit of fact.
Nice. I like it. All right, Paul, you have an opportunity to speak, which you do all the time, but you have the opportunity to speak to all the veterinary new grads of 2025, and you have a couple of minutes to give them one message or one bit of advice. What does Paul tell them?
So mine is really practical advice. Go get yourself a job in a bar or a restaurant while you're doing your veterinary training. I think learning skills of hospitality, customer service, teamwork, how to work under pressure and dealing with complaints will set you up for your career and give you those life skills that you absolutely need. It's a great job. Don't let it get you down.
I love that. Paul, thank you so much for your generous time and for the incredible work you do and for sharing the stuff that you're learning with the rest of the profession. It's very thought-provoking. It's going to make me think. I'm going to have to get back to you and say, well, hang on, I had other questions to follow up. Maybe we can talk about it on your podcast next.
Yeah.
We can talk about other stuff. I really appreciate that. Thanks for making the time. Before you disappear, I wanted to tell you about my weekly newsletter. I speak to so many interesting people and learn so many new things while making the clinical podcasts. So I thought I'd create a little summary each week of the stuff that stood out for me. We call it the VetVault 321, and it consists of 3 clinical pearls. These are 3 things that I've taken away from making the clinical podcast episodes. My light bulb moments. 2 other things. These could be quotes, links, movies, books, a podcast highlight, maybe even from my own podcast. Anything that I've come across outside of clinical vetting that I think that you might find interesting. And then 1 thing to think about, which is usually something that I'm pondering this week and that I'd like you to ponder with me. If you'd like to get these in your inbox each week, then follow the newsletter link in the show description wherever you're listening. It's free, and I'd like to think it's useful. Okay, we'll see you next time.